Welcome, Matthew Ehret. We are live and recording. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Kevin. Always a pleasure.
Thanks so much for your time. So listen, I've been listening and reading a lot of your stuff and Cynthia's by your wife's stuff too. I hope she's going to have some time soon because she had, I think, a lot of stress. And so we had to postpone the
The deadlines sometimes can weigh heavily. So I think she's navigating through the storm pretty well, executing the to-do list. But yeah, hopefully that works out.
No, she does great, amazing stuff, amazing content. I loved her, her work on, would it be technology or history or, I mean, both of you are just mind-boggling. The amount of content you put into, sometimes I'm wondering, where you take the energy, the time and
Try to stay zen. But actually, you're gonna really enjoy. We just finished working on a new film based on her essay. It's gonna be part of a 6-part series. Each one's about 20 minutes long, and we just finished the first one. It's gonna be pseudo animated as well to bring in why there are no limits to human progress. Introducing a lot of the false Malthusians, that like the ideology of limits to growth that was introduced politically, not scientifically, in the 70s. And it'll be a sharp video series, but we're going to make it available next week or so. So I'll send you a link.
Yeah, I think I read that comment or whatever that post that you did. Yeah, on what was it, on Twitter, Telegram, where you said, yeah, you're gonna transform this into more document, which I thought it's great, documentary, because you're gonna reach much more, of course, much more people.
Yeah.
Especially if you do it in a very suspenseful and thrilling way. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned Malthusian, so this is what we're going to talk about amongst other stuff. So I read your article, by the way. It's a great article. I mean, now the thing is, I remember in one of our first interviews we had, maybe it was the first chat we had, we just touched upon it very superficially, on Austrian economics, and you had, as I just remember, I don't even want to paraphrase you, but you had sort of a more critical point of view, or in regards to Austrian economics or Austrian economy or Austrian economists. Now, in that article, which maybe let me just put this on the screen just for the listeners and viewers. It's called, what's the name of it's called, the Keynes versus von Hayek debate, a false dualism with Malthusian characteristics. And now the thing is, I mean, as you know, I'm a Bitcoin. It's a focus. My podcast is focused on Bitcoin, and it's always rooted in Bitcoin. Everything I talk about, more or less. But Hayek, got pretty much a lot of let's say he's got well known in the Bitcoin community because of this. There was one quote of him. I think he did a interview. I think it was television or something. Many decades ago, before he died, and he said something like about a sly roundabout, how you can create a better money, is something that, I'm just paraphrasing, it's something that governments cannot touch, cannot destroy, and which is totally isolated from government and nation states. And that's the quote that's sort of got more famous within the Bitcoin circles. Now, I didn't know about the I know a lot about Keynes because I read all the books of Safed and Ammous. He's a really great Austrian economist, a scholar, and he used to be a professor himself and did a lot of research. Some of these books is really great, like Bitcoin Standard, the Fiat Standard, and now the new one, the Principles of Economics, where he also talked about the character of Keynes. By the way, he seems to be, there were some, correspondence letters from the Oxford Library or something where it came out he was a fucking pedophile. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So it says a lot, also about the economy.
Terrible human being.
Exactly. So he wasn't even an economist. He was, I think, wasn't he like a statistician or mathematician or something like that? So a lot of people, like Safed and Ammous, are making just fun of him because the whole premise, of a foundation of Austrian economics is not really based in logic or rational or, ethos. So, yeah. So why don't you just kick it off, Matthew, before I go on a rant? Why do you think, first of all, Hayek, I mean, when did he make those statements regarding Malthusian ideology? And did he stick to that, or was he always, a Malthusian sort of an advocate of population reduction? If I'm interpreting correctly. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, the particular quotes that I cite of von Hayek specifically, and yes, everything you've said about Keynes is correct, and it's so much worse even than what you've alluded to. Keynes is an absolute mathematician. He believed in the mathematization of all human systems, not specifically because he believed in the sort of moral virtues that he professed in some of his works on the surface, but those were really just words. The idea of, especially when you look at his role as vice president of the Eugenics Society for many years, he was a lifelong member, and he also, so not only was he a eugenicist, he was also a very high top leader in the Malthusian League, the Neo-Malthusian League, promoting a system of mathematical controls of global populations by a master class. He, as you said, was openly a pedophile who mathematically judged and graded every single one of his relations meticulously for years and years with young boys. Very, very disgusting person. He was a rampant racist, and he was a Cambridge apostle. I think that's part of the key thing to look at with Keynes, is that there are specific areas whereby if you should excel or find yourself a member of certain groups, certain people, I think everyone kind of knows of the Skull and Bones as sort of the Yale-based secret society set up in the 1830s by these Anglophile opium trading oligarchs in America who were always loyal to the British system of global management. These were the operatives who were the heirs or the sources of today's deep state that oversaw the murder of, I would say, about 8 American presidents who died while in office over the course of the ensuing 200 years. So Keynes was, so people know of the Skull and Bones, but they don't know of the Cambridge Apostles, which is much higher up in the chain of command. And every year in Cambridge, there's always 12 apostles who are sort of the inner creme de la creme, as they say, who will go on to be the upper level managers of the system. So like Bertrand Russell was a Cambridge apostle, Alfred North Whitehead. And now you're dealing not so much with the hands-on management, which is where, if you think about it, like the London School of Economics, the Oxford, these are perhaps at some points in deep history, Oxford might have produced some good people. But in my analysis, especially since the Rhodes Scholarship system was set up, the Rhodes Scholars were processed in Oxford, just like Fabians are processed in the London School of Economics, to become more hands-on managers of the system. They get their hands a little bit more dirty as mercenaries of the church of this British Empire. The Cambridge Apostles is more where the battle of ideas, the grand strategists, are processed. That's where you get a little bit more intelligence. And a lot more evil. So Keynes was a product of that processing system. Now there was people have been told, and I'll get to the question of von Hayek this way, because I really want people to get the context of this dualism that pretty much took over, especially during the Cold War, both political parties. Whereas now today, or especially since John F. Kennedy was murdered, most Democrats in the United States and most people on the so-called left of the political spectrum had to increasingly see themselves as Keynesians. And those who were conservatives were expected to adopt basically an Austrian school mode of thinking with either von Mises, von Hayek. Now, just to get clear, there are a lot of good people who are my friends who are members of the Austrian school. We get along okay, but this is my direct assessment as a historian looking at this battle of ideas. This is how I'm seeing we're being played. The whole idea of either being on the right or on the left, and thus being Keynesian or an Austrian school, was a product of social engineering. And the London Times was a conduit set up in 1932, as I go through in my article, that created and popularized right before Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in America. This is October 1932, a series of debates between the two schools, Keynes and von Hayek. The platform was the London School of Economics, which was the school where von Hayek was also teaching. Keynes was regularly giving lectures there, and that was sort of the domain that this was amplified into the zeitgeist. There are a lot of parallels, even though they seem different. Keynes and von Hayek were lifelong friends. That's the first thing to keep in mind. They were always lifelong friends. They were members of very similar organizations at different times. There was an offshoot, an outgrowth of the Fabian Society set up called the Mont Pelerin Society after World War II. It was set up in 1947. People like Karl Popper were founding members. So was von Hayek. Karl Popper, for those who don't know, is the teacher of George Soros. It's a long list. I go through many of the founding members, but the differences are superficial, and the differences largely are, one, Keynes promotes the idea that all systems, if you want to deal with it with an economic depression, let's say, which is what the cause of the driver of the 1932 debate was all about, is how do we solve the Great Depression? So they both had their own ideas. One was all based upon the idea that you need top-down control. The idea of personal liberty wasn't a consideration for the mathematician Keynes. It was all about top-down control, creating work, making work, giving so that people get paychecks. And it didn't really matter in the Keynesian system if you were getting government paychecks to do something totally useless. Like somebody could be paid to dig a hole, and the other person next door could be paid to fill the same hole up. Useless work, but they both get government paychecks. They will both then, Keynes said, go spend it at the store. That creates a demand for products. They have to buy groceries. Well, then the groceries are being made by farmers. The milk cartons are being made in factories. And so Keynes was saying, well, that will then create a demand for the factories and the farmers. And then that the factory work especially, will then require a demand for electricity grids and water systems, because factories require a lot of energy and water. And then that will then cause a demand for the government to then build infrastructure. So it was this weird, strange system. Von Hayek, on the other hand, basically made the point that no, you need to simply encourage people to have personal liberty, and they'll spend as they see fit. But just the idea of government intervention, government involvement in the economy was seen as co-equal to tyranny. So whether you had an Abraham Lincoln or a John F. Kennedy or a Franklin Roosevelt or a Hitler, they all used the government to do things in the economic sphere, and thus they were all equally tyrannical, because all roads would lead ultimately to pure fascist tyranny if you allowed the government to do that. So he had a separation between the individual and the government, with this assumption that will always lead you, if you permit the government to have a role to play, to fascism and tyranny. So there are a lot of points of similarity that I go through in my article, that both negated the reality that there was such a thing as the American national system of political economy that was neither that couldn't be fit into either school. It's not socialist, it's not communist, it's not free market capitalist. But when you look at those eight American presidents who died while in office, and you look at what they're doing something which is neither one of those extremes. And the empire works by extremes. Now, you asked me about Malthus. The place that I had noticed first and foremost von Hayek speaking about population control was in a 1981 interview. This is towards the end of his life. He had already won the Nobel Prize in the 70s, in Business Week, November the 11th, 1981. And that's his, it's a bit of an infamous quote. I'm not going to quote Keynes's remarks on overpopulation and depopulation, because they're bountiful.
Imagine.
It's just, but this is lesser known, because it's some places in his writings, he acts like he's not for population control, because that is infringing on the personal liberty of people and the personal choice, which is like sacred. But then in other places, there's not a consistency. This is towards the end of his life. And he says, over the next 20 years, the world population, I'm quoting him, is expected to double again. For a world that is founded on egalitarian ideas, the problem of overpopulation is unsolvable. If we guarantee that everyone who is born will be supported, we will soon no longer be able to fulfill that promise, since growth will outstrip resources. There is only one break for overpopulation, namely that the only ones who may survive and procreate are those who can support themselves. So the only people who you say are in a position where they're economically fit at the current moment, independent of the amount of injustice. You're not looking at the role of the IMF, the World Bank, to consciously keep people at a state of intrinsic poverty and economic insecurity. The point that he's coming at is that if you are economically fit to sustain your family, you may procreate. If you're not, you may not procreate. If you're just and that's the idea of the Herbert Spencer social Darwinism, in opposition to the Francis Galton idea. So you had this whole debate about a century before that quote between two different British imperial thinkers who were both taking Darwin's theory of evolution, which is not really a true scientific theory at all, especially the idea of the survival of the fittest, and having a false debate over how to apply it to human systems, where Herbert Spencer, who coined the term social Darwinism, took a liberal approach, saying, no, if we just let everything be and let the competition go, the unfit will be destroyed by the fit, and you will have just a natural ordering, like Darwin says occurs in nature, with no regulation. And then, Darwin's cousin Galton said, no. You need strong government top-down controls to manage this science of global purification of the gene pool. So people were debating and saying, oh, I'm going to be on that side or that side. No, the whole thing was wrong. It was all based on the same underlying core assumptions. The last, and I think the most disgusting thing from Hayek's remarks, is at the last page. There's a lot of nice things in his Road to Serfdom that I agree with, but then there's a lot of things that are these weird Trojan horses. At the last chapter, he says, and I quote, on world government, there must be a power which can restrain the different nations from acting harmful to their neighbors, a set of rules which defines what a state may do, and an authority capable of enforcing these rules onto states. The powers which such an authority would need are mainly of a negative kind. It must, above all, be able to say no to all sorts of restrictive measures. So he's essentially calling for a supranational power that has an enforcement capability, that is capable of enforcing rules in case anybody breaks away from the global system of free markets that he demands must be imposed onto this rules-based order. This is actually the heart of the rules-based international order. He's already writing this in 1944 that the Road to Serfdom is written. That's right there should cause everybody who says but he said all of these nice things here and here and here and here. Well, he's in his prime, intellectual prime, and he's writing that.
Matthew, just a quick question. I mean, is that the quote? I mean, it sounds like he's also advocating for eugenics. I mean, for not procreating, within the context of not. Is that, was he advocating?
I think he's taking more the Herbert Spencer line, which is why the Herbert Spencer is seen even today by many intellectual libertarians as a bit of a hero in the intellectual community. But I don't think he wouldn't go so far as to call himself a eugenicist the way somebody like a Keynes would, because he's of the view that no, everything should just be hands off and the weak will be weeded out naturally. We don't have to have social engineers organizing and enforcing negative eugenics onto those who are unfit. It'll just naturally happen as the strong, corporations, the strong will be able to defeat the weak and create powerful monopolies or whatever they might do, because that's what happens when you actually deregulate a banking system or corporations. They will naturally play dirty. They won't just play by honest rules of competition. They never do. Right. And they will then do what they've done to Ireland by depopulating Ireland by under the guise of free markets, or India by, they will destroy Indian textiles and destroy Indian population under the guise of free markets, which is what the British East India Company did for 200 plus years, or China or today's Africa, pumping opium down Chinese throats. The idea was never to make money off of opium. Certainly many people did do that, but the intention was always to destroy the creative and moral vitality of the Chinese people, to subdue the dragon and keep them under the heel of the British Empire. And they can't just say they want to do that. So they have to use an intellectual veneer of competition, market laws, and if the Chinese go and say, no, we don't want opium into our land, we're going to block it with restrictions. Well, that means, casus belli, act of war, and we'll bring gunboats to enforce the rules of free markets onto you. And so that's the thing. I mean, I think that Hayek would identify more with that type of loose hands off. But in reality, when you look at, well, what does he work for? What is the Austrian school? Why do we even call it? To be a good American, you have to be a good Austrian. Well, what was the Austrian school? Why do we even call it that? Well, the Austrian school, I mean, itself came out of the Habsburg dynasty. These inner families, the Habsburgs, the Saxe-Coburg-Goethes, the Thurn und Taxis families. Today we call them the Windsors, but it's the Saxe-Coburgs. They're all part of the same oligarchical inbred hive that they have different, and if they've had different jurisdictions in different parts of Europe or other places, but primarily it's concentrated in Europe. These are the heirs of the old Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire especially, that collapsed. And they will work together, and then sometimes they will compete and backstab each other, but they generally will commonly work on things that they can all agree have to be done. Number one, keep people in a state mentally of talking cattle, depopulated, fighting each other, that they can all agree on. They ultimately will fight for territory. So the Austrian school had, in the 19th century, innovated. The Austrian population and a lot of German-speaking people were not so ready to accept. They didn't have British liberalism as part of their culture. It's not the elites, not the people. Britain did have a liberalism. So Adam Smith was able to, and John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, David Say, Jeremy Bentham, Malthus, these were all British liberal thinkers. That was able to take hold very much within the British aristocracy and general culture, but it wasn't taking off anywhere else. But it was very effective at keeping nations subdued under a scientific veneer. So the Austrian management under the Habsburgs this is an evil empire. This is what created the Jesuits, right? Like the Habsburg Empire domination of Rome in the 1530s was the period that you had the institution of this mercenary secret society sect called the Jesuits, to both be an arm for the most radical feudal branch of the Catholic Church, but also to keep the Catholic Church, the papacy, and some cardinals in a line if they chose to develop their morality and work against the wishes of the feudalists. So it both worked to keep the papacy in check, but also at different times to enforce the most destructive variants of Catholic, what effectively became Catholic fascism of the Mussolini variety later on. So the Habsburgs were like, how do we bring this great system of manipulation and management into our world? So they had to basically repackage and rebrand what was Adam Smith and British liberalism under a new name, a new rebranding, and they called it the Austrian school. And you had people like Karl Menger, who was one of the—
that's what I was going to talk about, because your article focuses on Hayek, of course, but I mean, I'm not an Austrian economist scholar or anything, but the books and the articles I read, and because I'm in the Bitcoin community, it's all about, there's always bringing up Menger, and Mises, and then Rothbard much later. Now, the rational economists or rational thinkers, they usually do not. I don't have the impression or the perception that they, are like a huge fan or advocate or or quoting so much of Hayek. More like Hoppe, Hoppe, like what is it called? The god that failed, what is it called? The god that failed, or democracy that failed, or something like that, where it's like totally anti-state, anti-government. And just for our listeners and viewers, the fundamental principles of Austrian economics is like bringing back sound money, efficient allocation of capital, and then just getting rid of all this, eliminating all these the current monetary policies that we have that is based on Keynesianism or MMT, on printing money out of nothing. So fundamentally it's everything opposite, like bringing back some, would it be like gold or Bitcoin in this case, and reintroducing the efficient allocation of capital, efficiency, technological innovation, like La Belle Epoque. We hear also about La Belle Epoque, under the gold standard, where there were a lot of original, technological innovation, where there was still sound money and not the central banking system, especially since 1913 of the Federal Reserve. So, I mean, do you want to elaborate a little bit with a caveat or with a reservation? Like, what are you in favor, or do you know anything about like Austrian economics, what they're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to teach or to bring back, like sound principles, sound monetary principles?
Well, that's why I'm saying, like, yeah, I get along. Like, a lot of my friends are Austrian school people. Tom Luongo is a good friend of mine. The thing that I like about them is this love of liberty and this idea, exactly as you pointed out, the need for sound money that's tied to real value and freedom at the same time. That's good, and we can all agree with that. Also, people who are like not ideological about like all of the axioms, because I myself see, like, if you ask me what do I identify myself as, the closest thing I could come to would be something like a moral pragmatist. I look for things that work to solve problems of not just a material, but also spiritual, intellectual dimension within human society. So I look for
as a more holistic, with a ethos, right? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's sort of what. And I will find in different thought matrices, which usually have certain assumptions, whether, if you're a communist, and I have friends who are Marxists, and we get along because we agree on certain moral principles. Like, we believe that you should increase the productive powers of labor to leap over the limits to growth, which is the opposite of what a Keynesian or a Malthusian says. No, you should always be an animal adapting to your limits under a system of management. So, but then you also have Marxists who think that way too. So, nothing is so clean cut. So I look for people who have moral values and will try to find the best in the thing that they have been influenced by to solve problems. And usually you can get people from the left, from the right, to work together on common principled things like that. So even today, like there's there's movements coalescing that involve people like Jill Stein from the Green Party and people like Caleb Malpoint, who's a devoted Marxist, but they're both good people. I disagree ideologically with the things that are influencing both of them, but they're both two very good people who really don't want World War III, and they really want to win the United States back from the deep state. And so I can work with that. Like, that's something I can recognize, and they can work together, and people who think on those terms can do the same. So, there's people who like Ron Paul, who is speaking at their events too for peace. And Ron Paul is a great person. And Rand Paul is a courageous person, even though they're libertarians and I don't agree with everything that they believe in about the nature of government. But despite that, they're working with Jill Stein and they're working with Caleb Malpain, and they're giving speeches, or at least Ron Paul was giving speeches at their events. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we have been, I think, stripped of the right to understand the principled battle between oligarchical systems and what one might call I really like the theories of Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, who started off originally as a Marxist. He's often called a libertarian by his enemies or detractors. He's also called an anti-Semitic fascist because he's talked about the George Soros and the Rothschilds. So obviously that means you're an anti-Semitic fascist. He recently passed away in 2019. And so it was by my studies of his work, and I became a volunteer with his organization about what are we dealing with here? 15 years ago. I parted ways with the organization about 5 years ago. But during that time, it was a very enriching intellectual experience where I first encountered the idea that there was such a thing as the American system of political economy. I had known of the writings of Friedrich List, a German economist who did a lot to unite Germany for the first time as a sovereign nation state around the Zollverein, the customs union. But I didn't know much more than that. But then in doing the research around the LaRouche organization, their researchers, and digging up a lot of the firsthand material, I began to realize, no, the reason why Friedrich List was able to do what he did with what he coined as the national system of political economy was because he studied for 5 years in America. He lived in the United States between 1824 and 1829, studying how the American system of constitutional banking functioned after the War of Independence, and especially the Constitutional Convention. And so he looked at how did the miracle of America's early survival occur when after the War of Independence, the 13 states were irreparably bankrupt. There was hardly any manufacturing. There was very little infrastructure of meaning. The states had protectionism between each other, so they couldn't even unify. They couldn't collect taxes. There was 2 banks. That's all. Everybody else was just, I mean, there was no real coherence, and they were fighting each other. And it was only a matter of time before the British Empire regained control of their lost belligerent colony. And so, but it didn't work out that way. They ended up quadrupling their population within 40 years. They ended up outproducing Britain in almost everything by the 1850s. And so Friedrich List, this process was already moving in a very interesting way, breaking all the rules of what you would think would be possible. And they paid off all their debts by the 1800s, early 1800s, like 1802. They paid off their debts. They were able to buy Louisiana from Napoleon. Like all of this stuff was going on. So Friedrich List was studying how is this possible, and so he recognized that you had this thing called Hamiltonian economics, which itself came from the study of Ben Franklin's work on paper currencies, on Ben Franklin's necessity on the increase of mankind in 1851, and the earlier school of France, especially what's called the dirigist school of Jean-Baptiste Colbert and Cardinal Jules Mazarin. Colbert was the finance minister of France. And so a lot of these founding fathers, especially Hamilton and also John Jay, were studying Colbertism and how France was able to develop in such a miraculously powerful way, especially after the Peace of Westphalia, and building canals, making sure that the credit of the nation, the money went not just into war profiteering, but with the peace process that was made possible by the establishment of the sovereign nation state system itself in 1648. That was called the Peace of Westphalia, organized by Mazarin primarily, the Eminence Grise of France. They were able to put an end to this ongoing religious warfare that had been plaguing Europe for centuries. It wasn't just 30 years, it was long before that. And all sides, Protestant killing Catholic, were all getting funded by the same financiers, the same London, Venetian. Huh? Yeah, we've seen this before. It works. And so with the peace process that occurred thereafter, based upon the recognition of the sovereign nation state for the first time, and also the idea of the benefit of the other, that my identity will be based upon my power to benefit my neighbor instead of going to war with them to steal their stuff. You could finally have the treasuries, the money in the treasury move towards not funding wars, but now funding canals, like the Midi Canal. That was the biggest canal of in world history, built up under Colbert, which upshifted the quality of the education of the people, the workforce. It created a driver, a new set of demands, because new industries were created to build this canal. And it was partially private. It was public-private. It was a private company with a private engineer who had a great idea. He was able to sell it to the king, because, they basically took orders, like who could get the job done in the most efficient way. This guy he had a good pitch, and he was brilliant, and it worked. And it had like lifts and locks and dams. Like there's so many things going on in there. And it was a real miracle in terms of the ability to increase the longevity of the people of France, but also surrounding adjacent regions in Germany, then Prussia. It created a basis of trust where there was none before. And it also increased the population in ways that the Malthusians despised. So, of course, the American founding fathers, many of the best ones, were all studying how did this work in the past. There were, and how can we do this in the context that we need to do it, which is what was done when Hamilton came up with the idea of consolidating the debts of the 13 states after the War of Independence into a new debt, but now with a new character, where this new debt was tied to credit that would then be issued through national banks with branches in each of the states that would then give loans to entrepreneurs, to people who had great ideas to build things. And it was all tied to internal improvements. And you would unify the nation that way. You'd have an ability to coordinate action amongst the whole nation and create an identity that would be able to then defend against the onslaught of the City of London, the global command center of evil, in my view, and the things like the British East India Company that were always consciously doing battle to destroy and undermine the young republic. So you need a nation state for that reason. That's why empires want to get rid of nation states and create world government. So Friedrich List was studying that, and that's what he brought to Germany to unify the warring baronial states of Germany, and where you had little princelings from the old days of the Holy Roman Empire, where you had like 2,000 little zones of jurisdiction of little mercenaries with their little mini armies and their little mini forms of credit. There was fighting each other for scraps of land. That was still a problem of Germany in the 19th century. So Friedrich List was able to finally organize like hell. This guy was a master organizer, and he came up with the idea in the 1840s of the Zollverein, of the idea of doing what America did after the war and create a protective tariff around a communion of adjacent states that would then internally emit credit through a type of state banking system for the investments into the canals. The railroads were a big one that would then justify the qualitative increase of the economy in a full spectrum way. And you'd be able to finally build industries that you had no industries before that. Everyone was stuck on agrarianism. And all of a sudden you had an impetus to have now industries emerge that gave people more economic independence. And the empire had
local governments. Was he like sort of an advocate of local, like regional or local,
it's a balance,
decentralized governance, or
a balance of both? Like the idea is the people are the government. So it's a different philosophy. Like philosophically, it's like every individual for a sovereign nation to work has to look in the mirror and see themselves as an active, as the government. And for that to work, I have to take responsibility and be an active participant, not just voting every few years, but actively participating in town hall meetings, in participating in holding my representatives accountable, things like that. So it's a different philosophy. You can't be disengaged in that sense culturally for that system to be viable. If people then detach, then you get a tyrannical system. Then the government will always be usurped because it's a great power, and great power can do great evil or great good. And if people all disengage, yeah, guaranteed, it's only a matter of when those oligarchs will then use those power structures to then crush the people and use whatever they want in the nation to crush other nations for their benefit. Like the US has been assigned to play that role since World War II, crushing Africa, crushing small nations that want to develop. That's the power of the US government. Economically, militarily, has been usurped by those who killed JFK. They killed Franklin Roosevelt. They killed Lincoln. They killed McKinley. They killed Harding. They killed Garfield. They killed Zachary Taylor. They killed William Harrison. Like all of these American presidents who all died.
I find it pretty interesting that, because most people, I mean, to be honest, I heard that from you from the first time. I didn't know that. I thought, maybe it was JFK and maybe Lincoln, but most people like myself, we didn't know that there were so many presidents assassinated, or at least assassination attempts, right?
Oh, fuck yeah, man. No, I mean, and sorry for the language, but yeah, it surprised me too, because I'm a Canadian. So we don't learn about any of this stuff in Canadian history. Like it's not, I had to, try to really search this out because my paradox was, if the US is the global empire, as everyone seems to believe, and they certainly give us a lot of evidence to justify that belief, Why is it that the American people are suffering? America has created a world that is a lot less stable. Their security is a lot less insured. They're on the verge of an economic collapse. That's all visible, clear. And their leaders tend to get shut. And at first I thought it was just like Lincoln and JFK. And then you start digging at it and you're like, wait a minute. No, Franklin Roosevelt also died really fast while he was still president. And then you're like, wait a minute. Warren Harding, who was also trying to revive a Lincoln policy and was fighting against the League of Nations, the first attempt in the 20th century at a one world government. Well, Warren Harding was also, he died really fast too from like, they didn't even do an autopsy. We're told it's oyster poisoning. And you're like, what about Garfield? Seems like he had a whole program. He was a Lincoln Republican in 1860 or 1880 as president, who fought in the Civil War and had a whole program to take the U.S. military and declare war on Britain. He was killed.
Okay, so substantial evidence was there, always the background motive.
Yeah, motive is consistently clear. And McKinley, same thing. McKinley had a whole like revival of the protective tariff, that, you know, the nation had to use a protective tariff to defend the manufacturers and the agriculturers from cheap dumping of goods by the British East India Company or other foreign operations. So you want to cultivate your local industry to stand on your own 2 feet. He was killed, and he had a whole plan for South America as well to help facilitate South American nations to have access to industries, to rail. He had a whole plan to connect the Darien Gap from Central to South America by rail, as well as so many things. And so he got killed in 1901. And but there's people even before Lincoln, and you're like, they're all doing the same thing. It's all of them, and even like Harrison, William Harrison. Before it was the Whig Party, it was like all of the leading players in America who were like the best, most solid intellectual fighters against evil were primarily around the 1820s, 30s, centering themselves around what's called the Whig Party. John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, before the Republican Party was created. Then at a certain point, the Whig Party became too corrupted, and the best of them had to break away and create the Republican Party, which they did in 1856, as an anti-slave party, right? Like originally it was the Democratic Party that was understood to be the party of the slave and the slave power in Wall Street. But so William Harrison he died after 3 months in office, but on his desk, you had legislation to revive the Third National Bank that had been killed earlier by Andrew Jackson in 1836. And in 1840, there was a plan to revive it, because when that bank was killed, and yeah, I know we're told that was the precursor to the Federal Reserve. I know that's the story. I know we're told that Hamilton was a Rothschild stooge. I know we're told that stuff. I can guarantee you it's all a lie. That's a mythology that was created over 2 centuries ago, and it's never been true. The Federal Reserve is a takeover. The Hamilton National Bank is not a Federal Reserve bank. Jackson was an asset of Aaron Burr. His house, the Jackson Mansion, was used as the headquarters for Burr's third attempt to break up the Union in 1807, when you had a whistleblower who blew the whistle to Congress, to Jefferson, and said, by the way, you have a conspiracy to kill you, Jefferson. Declare war against Spain, with Burr at the head of a new empire being set up called the Western Confederacy, that would then take control of Louisiana and New Orleans. This, I think he was a senator. He blew the whistle. They had congressional hearings. The headquarter was Andrew Jackson's house that Aaron Burr had selected to be the basing of operations, to work with the British and then take control of the North and then undo the American Constitution. That was the whole thing, and join up with Canada. And the slave power of the South, we're gonna have their own new country too, with their own new constitution. It took another 50 years after that failed to revive the plan in the form of the Civil War, but that's what was done. So when Burr left, he basically made his way. He was so hated in America that he had to escape to go to Britain via Canada, where Burr lived for 5 years at Jeremy Bentham's house, the head of British intelligence. He lived at his house doing opium and prostitutes for 5 friggin' years. And he writes a journal, a dedicated, devoted journal of his heinous, hedonistic exploits with Jeremy Bentham. and then comes back weeks before the War of 1812 against Britain is launched and starts rebuilding his political machine of Tammany Hall. He's the guy who created and ran Tammany Hall. He's the guy who also founded the Bank of Manhattan, or used the Bank of Manhattan to create the basis for Wall Street. That's Aaron Burr. So Burr is the first guy to start bringing Jackson as the War of 1812 war hero into political play, which his letters are there for anybody to read, of him saying Jackson will be the person who we make president in 1815 in order to do what he was not able to do, which is destroy Alexander Hamilton, who he'd already killed, but destroy now Hamilton's baby. I mean, I'm not talking about Philip Hamilton, who he also killed. 2 years before he killed Hamilton's child through another duel, which is why Hamilton and Burr used the exact same guns on the exact same spot, where 2 years earlier, Hamilton's son Philip had been killed by one of Burr's disciples on the same spot in New Jersey with the same guns. Like there's a story there. I don't fully understand all the details, but that speaks loudly. But he had to kill the National Bank of Hamilton, which they did by corrupting it from within. They installed, the Van Buren. Van Buren was also a personal lawyer for Aaron Burr too. He's part of the Burr machine with Jackson. Both became president, and Van Buren's people quickly infested the bank. They took over the control of the National Bank to run it to misuse it, and it gave people a good reason to feel burned by it. But as soon as they then killed the National Bank under Jackson, America went into a bank panic, open speculation, open free markets reigned supreme, and all of the national projects like the Erie Canal, all of the rail projects that were being built up in the 1820s and 30s, everything stopped. It's like the IMF telling Greece that you're not allowed to spend your national capital on, you want to build a sewage system? No, you have to pay your debt. Paying the debt became the only thing that anybody valued. And of course, what happens to Greece? Well, the people suffer, they die sooner, all of these things. So the social fabric breaks down and the nation becomes more owned. You privatize your state assets in order to get money to pay your debt. And that's the way the IMF and the World Bank have colonized the world since World War II. It's that technique. And that's what was done.
Africa, because, Greece is just one example. I mean, the exposed colonial, powers to be, whether it be France or most people I didn't know, I think it was Alex Gladstein who wrote now, a book, or actually several articles in a book about the exposed colonization of Africa, where like 14, 15 African states are still actually colonized by the, what do you call it? The CFR franc, something like that, where they're still, being totally dependent on and exploited by the French colonial powers, actually. But because you were talking about, you're talking about IMF and the World Bank. I mean, these are the biggest criminal organizations on this planet that have been systematically exploiting.
Like you said, France Afrique, the French banks issue the coin for you just said, 14, 15 countries. Economically, they've never been permitted to stand up on their own 2 feet. And every time they come close, their leader who tries to do that, whether it's Thomas Sankara or Kwame Nkrumah or Patrice Lumumba, or there's a Haile Selassie, they're either overthrown in a coup d'etat, they're assassinated, and the nation is then subjected to shock therapy to punish them for the belligerence of their effort to have real freedom. And so this goes back a long ways. This is not it has a new 20th century sort of smell to it, but it's the same old technique that was done again and again. So this was done in America to itself by these agents who were always, and I make the case in my book series as well as in that article, but especially in my book series, that the thing called the deep state, the Council on Foreign Relations, the worst elements of the Pilgrim Society in America, the Skull and Bones operation earlier on, or even Wall Street itself, was set up as a fifth column devoted to the orders of an agency across the ocean representing these old ancient bloodlines of the Black nobility that always just want to restore global feudalism and undo things like the Renaissance. They want to just undo the Renaissance. They want to go back in time to some imaginary state where things were somehow perfect when everybody was happy, being a little underdeveloped, peasant eating bugs with no property. That's what they've always wanted. It's not a new thing. It's always been there as a desire. And the League of Nations was a big part of that originally in the 20th century after World War I, right? So, I mean, as far as like whatever type of credit takes away their power, whatever form or principled system removes the influence of the oligarchical parasite, I will support. And to the degree that people can come up with models of Bitcoin that will do that, I will support that. To the degree that there's models of Bitcoin that are subject to speculation and other forms of instability, I will not support that, because I don't see what it's not all Bitcoin is equal, right? And I think everyone knows that not all protectionism is equal. Sometimes protectionism can be done to the detriment of the nation that's doing the protectionism. That'll happen. So I'm not always for protectionism. It has to be done with the explicit intent to develop the powers, the productive powers, and the freedom of the people. If it's not, that's bad. It's like Canada. We have protectionism under the British Empire between each of the provinces of Canada. The provinces don't enjoy free trade amongst each other, even though we call ourselves a sovereign nation. So it's actually, what kind of nation can you have where you're fighting over each other and you're paying more for Quebec hydro if you're a businessman, if you're a business in Ontario trying to import hydroelectricity from Quebec than somebody in New York would be paying something like 70% less than what you would be paying to your fellow Canadians. It's not designed with the intention of developing a nation. It's not. The intention is to keep the nation divided, underdeveloped, and used as a weapon against the American Republic, which unfortunately is too much of the case of Canada's entire identity in our history as a geopolitical chess piece on the grand chessboard. It's not a good protectionism.
Yeah, maybe can we just at this moment? I mean, Canada. When there's a there's a video of Trudeau, for example, taking the oath, and he's taking the oath to the Privy Council, right? I mean, maybe you can elaborate on like whose allegiance are you guys? I mean, or not you, but the prime ministers or the state officials are what kind of allegiance are you giving? I mean, are you giving it to the crown? Right?
Yeah, it's disgusting, eh? Yeah,
it's
exactly
pretty bad. Yeah.
Yeah, every prime minister has to be inducted into the Privy Council, and as you're made a member of Privy Council, you have to give an oath of allegiance to both His Majesty in this case and the heirs of the crown into perpetuity, and that you have to now abide by oaths of secrecy. Right, you'll keep secret all things that ought to be kept secret in Privy Council. As a good servant must, says Justin Trudeau. It is on his oath. If you're an immigrant coming to Canada, you have to pledge allegiance to the crown. As an entity, it's a supranational entity, and it people think of it as being just symbolic, but it is not symbolic. It has a real power, and it has a real machinery around it that people don't appreciate in terms of the control of crown corporations, crown lands. The crown is the world's biggest landowner in the world by a huge margin. Something like 89% of the land in Canada is crown land, right?
Wow.
Like,
and international and globally?
No, I talked about Canada.
Okay.
Globally, it's still like
substantial. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the person who's the second biggest landholder behind the crown is like, it's a far second. Like wow. We're talking here like a fraction of a fraction. So, and then you have crown estates, like something like most of the seabed all around the island of Great Britain is all owned by the crown directly, all of the land, the castles, but also then you have the Habsburg. So a lot of even though the Habsburg Empire dissolved after World War I in the Treaty of Versailles as an empire, the same families, the Otto von Habsburg, and a lot of the leading families that did so much evil, overseeing the Inquisition, doing so much rapaciousness around the world, they're still dominant families with all of their territorial possessions, their castles, their trusts, their fondies. And this is the thing, like, so here, this gets back to the question of von Hayek and Keynes. So the way this game was played, the way I could see it, after McKinley was killed in 1901, you had the takeover of this Anglo-American parasite in America under the form of Theodore Roosevelt, who created the first real Anglo-American special relationship. And he also oversaw the creation of the FBI, America's first secret police agency. Warren Harding was another eugenicist. Both of them were eugenicists, Theodore Roosevelt and Warren Harding, who gave vast support to the Rockefeller Foundation, to all of these eugenics cults that were also in the midst of funding this across Europe, to the pseudoscience of defining how do you purify the human gene pool and sterilize the unfit using mathematical statistical analysis. This is why Keynes fit in really well with that. It's all about statistics, right?
This is the fundamental difference. I think this is important because between Austrian economics, it's more about human action, and the difference, to the comparison to the esoteric pseudoscience of Keynesian or MMT, because they all want to calculate, economics, which is, just merely impossible, right? I think this is a good point just to emphasize that.
Yeah, both of them, they're both like MMT and Keynes are like, you're correct to note that they're almost the same thing. MMT, modern monetary theory, is a complete fraud, and it is like just sort of a retooled Keynesianism. But the way I tend to look at it from the standpoint, I approach things always from the standpoint of history first, the battles over historical dynamics, and then I sort of use that as a context in which to analyze what sort of economic structure is being fought for, what type of idea of value within the monetary system is being fought for. But my thing is, I first look at the battles, the assassinations, the policies to end the oligarchy, those things first. And so one of the things I can know is not only was McKinley killed, and not only was this eugenic structure amplified in America against the wishes of the true American patriots, but World War I was also artificially caused. It was not a natural occurring war. It was artificially caused. And it was caused by the targeted assassination of certain people, especially Archduke Ferdinand, but also there were others. You had 20 different assassinations in the 20 years outside of Russia, in Germany and France, from the 1880s all the way up, really, from the 1880s to 1914. I said 20. It's a lot more than 20 assassinations, really. Presidents like Sadi Carnot, the president of France, was assassinated in 1895. And my God, it's a huge list. 2 czars, and you could spend a lot of time making a list of great leaders. But again, like in the case of the American presidents, you tend to find that these were people who were obstructing the design to create an all-out new 7 Years' War, because the 7 Years' War was sort of the first world war of Europe. There was always an effort to do that again. But the problem was these pesky asshole humans with political power were often creating alliances, creating peace treaties, trying to work together to create win-win environments against those who want to start fires. So they had to be killed, and that was done. That was the age of assassinations in my mind. So that led up to World War I. Coming out of World War I, the solution was world government, right? That's the obvious solution, because the idea was, well, nation states, we tolerated the existence of nation states, and nation states caused the war. So if you don't want war, just get rid of nation states and give your sovereignty over to a supranational body called the League of Nations. And then that could, give us all security and stability and all these good things. Now, most people didn't want that. A lot of people did, but a lot of people didn't. And it was really rejected in America. The United States nationalists, under the Lincoln nationalists, came back to power around the figure I mentioned earlier, Warren Harding. And Warren Harding refused to go along with giving up your military to the supranational entity or your economic powers. And he continued to make bilateral treaties with China, with Hungary, with Germany, with Russia, outside of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations was demonstrating that they were actually more impotent if they couldn't enforce these sorts of things. And he was doing a damn good job of it too. He was also bringing back protectionism to America, and really pushing back against the eugenics overhaul of our different states that was already underway. 30 US states were already practicing eugenics by 1930, like racial sterilization based on statistics. So he had to be killed. He was eliminated. But there were two approaches to bringing, sort of pulverizing the spirit of the Europeans. One was in the form of the Versailles Treaty was a conscious, deliberate attempt to completely annihilate the defeated German economy, right? And the broader Austro-Hungarian Empire that was dissolved. So in the case of Weimar, you had this approach, which was, let's just print money to pay the debts that we'll never be able to pay. Because at the same time as you're trying to print the money, you can't even produce value because all of your rail is being confiscated. The Ruhr region that produces so much steel and coal is being confiscated by France, and Alsace and Lorraine are all being, and Silesia are all being captured, and stolen from Germany, which are the most rich, productive economic zones. So they don't have the economic means of producing anything, but they have printing presses. So they're told, let's print the money. And of course, what happens? Of course, you're going to destroy your economy. It's going to go hyperinflation. You're going to wipe your ass with money. So that's what happens. But there was another solution. Warren Harding was part of a network. And in 1922, you had what was known as the Rapallo Agreements. And the Rapallo Agreements were organized by Walter Rathenau, a leading follower of Friedrich List in Germany, who had his assistant, Kurt von Schleicher was his assistant. Kurt von Schleicher went on to become chancellor 10 years later. Rathenau organized with the new Russian government an annulment of the Versailles Treaty debt payments and an agreement that Germany and Russia would begin to work together on industrial progress and infrastructure, and also military sharing agreements in 1922. And American diplomacy was supporting this. So this was creating an environment where the Friedrich List Society of Germany was coming back into play. And just like I made the point that Karl Menger was created in order to subvert and prevent the spread of the Friedrich List movement, people like Eugen Düring was a leading figure of this in Germany, who was also an enemy of Karl Marx. They repackaged Adam Smith in the 1870s, and Karl Menger, who was the teacher of Frank Knight, John Chapman, von Hayek, von Mises, Karl Menger is the key. Karl Menger founded this school, and he was the retainer of the houses of Habsburg and Wittelsbach. He was the personal tutor of the heir to the Habsburg throne. These were courtiers of the Habsburg Empire who were rebranding Adam Smith in service of the Habsburg Empire, of the Austrian school. That's where that came from, in order to prevent the spread of Friedrich List and his followers, who are otherwise using a different idea of economics under what, von Bismarck applied this for the Zollverein and other things, and also for developing rail into Russia. And they were doing that also in Russia under Sergei Witte, the finance minister and transport minister of Russia, who brought this whole system into Russia and wanted to unite it with China around rail development, protectionism, national credit. It was a way of harmonizing personal property, personal entrepreneurship with national welfare at the same time, not one or the other. You don't have to pick one extreme. And that was the fraud. So in the case of Walter Rathenau in 1922, well, he was quickly assassinated by the organization Consol. This was an anarchist terrorist cell. All of these anarchist terrorist cells, by the way, just like we see ISIS today being used by intelligence agencies to destroy and undermine leaders or governments you don't like right now, ISIS is predictably attacking Niger, predictably, in the form of Boko Haram. Well, that's because they're always being funded, bankrolled, directed by the CIA and Pentagon. That's not a new thing.
They've always been assets.
Yeah, the terrorist movement was in the form of these anarcho-terrorists that had their cells in Poland with the Black Hand. That was a Black Hand terrorist cell that killed Archduke Ferdinand. In America, that was what killed McKinley, was a British-directed terrorist network under Emma Goldman, who called for killing leaders to bring about a society of personal freedom of everybody. If you just got rid of the political leaders and got rid of the establishment of political systems, then you could have personal liberty everywhere. And that was the logic of these anarchists. There were a lot of them were followers of Mikhail Bakunin and Prince Kropotkin, who were also high-level oligarchs, especially Prince Kropotkin, who goes back to the House of Ruhr, the Rurik dynasty, and he saw himself as the heir to the Russian throne. It was his operation in Russia that was working with Emma Goldman that launched the murder of Tsar Alexander II in 1880, the same month that Garfield was also killed by one of these creatures in America. Emma Goldman was in prison, and she was released from prison on bail by Bertrand Russell because both of them were members of the Neo-Malthusian League, and it was the same Neo-Malthusian League that Keynes ended up leading a few decades later. So you see how this whole thing is like organized by one center of command. I'm just saying that to paint that picture, because Walter Rathenau, who organized the Rapallo Accords that would have eliminated the Versailles Treaty, it would have made hyperinflation in Germany impossible because it was all based on a revival of what works, building up industries, building up science, technology, working for foreign policy ententes. He was killed by the Organization Consol, that then it changed its name after it was legalized. They killed 300 other German leaders at that same time. 300 German leaders on a municipal, federal, and provincial level were all assassinated because they were all parts of the same Friedrich List Society movement by the Organization Consol. So the Consol they changed their name and they became the paramilitary group of the new Nazi party that started as a fringe group, but was always being cultivated and funded by the same Wall Street, London bankers, the Morgans, the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, the Standard Oil Machine, the Bank of England. That was always there making this fringe group become popular, become successful. So anyway, hyperinflation wasn't necessary, but by killing Rathenau, and Schleicher then narrowly saved his life and he became chancellor, but he was killed by Hitler later on. What happened was you had this false dichotomy of being told, well, as people who have lost World War I, you have a choice. You could either print money, so the Weimar Republic did that, or you can cut the budget and you can enforce massive budgetary restrictions on all state spending. And so people who might need support because their lives, it's post-war, right? Lives are wrecked. There's no jobs. Some people need some state support. All of that has to stop to save money. Now, those are the two choices. We know what happened with Weimar Germany hyperinflation. We know the solution of that was what Hjalmar Schacht introduced as far as trade in your billions of dollars of Reichsmarks and we'll give you a shiny new Rentenmark and you can now spend it with these new constraints under, the Nazi thing. Well, the Austrian government was also in 1919, the actual first fascist government was not Mussolini's Italy. It was actually Austria, was the first fascist government. And the economic advisor to the 1919 Austrian fascist government was Ludwig von Mises and his personal assistant, Friedrich von Hayek, both. They advised and shaped a policy of massive austerity in the face of the debt repayment demands. And they did that by exactly what, again, the IMF and World Bank demand of poor countries like whatever the pigs nations, as they call them, of Portugal, Spain, Greece, but also Africa and everything else. Cut the budget, austerity, pay your debts. So oftentimes, a lot of the followers of von Hayek celebrate themselves for being so much better than the Weimar crowd because they didn't print the money to pay the debt. They cut the budget to pay the debt. Just like Andrew Jackson says, I paid the debt. It's like, yeah, but your whole nation went into speculative hell on earth and you stopped building anything. You went to fucking hell because you did that and you stopped investing in the future. So anyway, it's the sort of same logic. And then afterwards, Arthur Salter, who's on the League of Nations Supreme Economic Council, is in charge of Austria. He's working closely with von Mises and von Hayek the whole time pushing this thing. And then Mises also becomes the advisor to Engelbert Dollfuss, who's the chancellor of Austria from 32 to 34, another fascist. A different variety of fascists than Hitler. They had their own branding of fascism, but they both basically, and the thing about all of these characters is that they're all members of, for those who didn't like the League of Nations as a world government and they wanted to keep national sovereignty, there was an accommodation made for them. And it was called, in 1922, as Rathenau was being killed, as Warren Harding was being killed, you had what's called Count Richard Coudenhove Kalergi creates Pan-Europa, the Pan-European movement. All of these members from Engelbert Dollfuss to Arthur Salter to Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi finance minister, they are all disciples and devoted members of exactly that, pan-Europeanism, the Coudenhove-Kalergi pan-Europa. All of them are members, because the idea is we can say we don't like one world government, but what we'll do is we'll promote regional sovereignty. So we'll start promoting like a United States of Europe. We'll start promoting a European, like these different regions that can be then jurisdictions under fascist management, then beholden to receive orders and commands by the bankers that will be at the top of the food chain at the end of the day. So that was always the game. And this is sort of the thing between, I think, when you look at Keynes, who was a big player in the 1932. So the same point that Kurt von Schleicher, after he becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1932 in January, it only lasts 1 year. And you have the Friedrich List Society coming online, the Lautenbach plan for building like a New Deal for Germany, based on and really shutting down the Nazi machine, shutting down eugenics, promoting industrial development, scientific progress. That was very similar to what Franklin Roosevelt was preparing to bring online in America around the same time. That only lasted 1 year. And when Hitler was brought in, I'm not sure of all of the backroom deals, but Hindenburg definitely had some bribes, some weak spots. They capitalized on it, and he quickly inducted Hitler to become chancellor in February of 1933. And Hitler didn't lose any time burning down the Reichstag, right? He did that quick. And then declaring, we need dictatorial powers, enabling acts to restore order because the Jews and the commies burnt down our parliament building. Never was the case. It was always an inside job by the SS. But he never intended to give those powers back to the people. It was always designed to be what it was. So, and that's when Kurt von Schleicher was killed in the Night of the Long Knives. I think that was like in 1934 or something. He was killed along with many others. But Keynes came into play in the same time that the debate between Keynes and von Hayek is being set up by the London Times. You have Keynes also being assigned the role to organize what becomes the London Bankers Conference. So starting in 1933, you have 65 nations being brought together in London to settle the problem of the Great Depression by creating a one world banking currency, a one world economic architecture, and Keynes is all behind that. And the whole idea is nobody's allowed to be in too much debt or be in too much surplus. Everybody has to be in mathematical equilibrium, such that if a nation produces too much outside of its quota, it will be confiscated and then redistributed as whatever social engineers see fit. This was done again by Keynes when Keynes came back into play in 1944, overseeing the British delegation for Bretton Woods. That was his
classical central planning and centralization, right?
Well, it's not. Don't oversimplify it, because it's feudalism masquerading as capitalism, but it's always feudalism. It's not even central planning, because you also have good central planning too, whereby you have a national bank used to fund the development of a nation for the good that is true, that harmonizes with personal freedom. There's examples of that occurring. And this is why they tried to kill Franklin Roosevelt twice, with a banker's coup and with an assassination attempt in February of 1933 by Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian Freemason in America who shot 5 times and barely missed Roosevelt, killing Cermak standing next to the mayor of Chicago, standing next to Roosevelt. But they wanted to, because Roosevelt was bringing back the Abraham Lincoln system of the greenbacks, but under a new name. He brought back the Hamiltonian Friedrich List system of the national bank, but under a new name, because he couldn't control the Federal Reserve. So the best thing he could do is he put one of his industrialist friends, Mariner Eccles, into the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve to start kind of forcing it to abide by some national constraints. But otherwise, he had to create or use the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a national bank, even though it was created originally before Roosevelt came into power. It wasn't doing much. And by the end of World War II, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation had given more loans to businesses than all of the New York banks and the Federal Reserve combined. It was the driving force of the map. And this is why people have a hard time placing Roosevelt in a category of either, because it's like, yeah, he did big government, but you also had, and that's why, libertarians attack Roosevelt because they're like, he's a communist who did big government. But it's like the communists also attack Roosevelt because you had the biggest flourishing of entrepreneurship and private business under his watch too. So they're like, oh, he was a whore for the capitalists, and that's why they hate Roosevelt. And both sides don't know how to pigeonhole, because he doesn't fit into those categories we've been told we have to fit our brains into. And he hated Keynes. Like, he actually said Keynes is a mathematician with fetishes, to his personal secretary and friend Francis Perkins, who wrote a book documenting their exchanges. And Keynes openly called Roosevelt an economic incompetent. They didn't like each other. And yet we are all today told by CFR, Council on Foreign Relations funded historians, that Roosevelt was a Keynesian and to be a good, and that's why they call it the Green New Deal today. They call it the New Deal because they're trying to revive. People have a sort of warm, positive sentiment in their memory banks of the New Deal somehow being good, but it's fuzzy because history, we don't know our history. So they give it that warm, fuzzy sentimentality, and they call it a green thing. The New Deal was anti-green. It was all based on massively increasing productivity, industrial output, but they're using that, and they're telling us that was what Roosevelt was. It wasn't that. So, but then coming out of the whole process, you have again the Fabian Society creates a branch, because the Fabian Society and the Rhodes Scholarship groups, they work very closely together, the Fabians and the Rhodes Scholars, and they have organizations like the Roundtable Movement that becomes the CFR. You have subgroups like the Brookings Institute, that becomes a subgroup of that for the leftists to organize themselves around. But then you also have things like, it's actually, the word left and right means nothing anymore. Actually, forget the word leftist and right. It's deceiving. It doesn't mean anything, because you could have like socialist feudalists and capitalist feudalists, but they're united in their feudalism, and that's what you have with things like the Mont Pelerin Society. So some of the early sponsors of the Mont Pelerin Society, the founders of it, become people like von Mises, von Hayek, Klapman, Frank Knight, the guy who's the teacher of Milton Friedman, Walter Lippmann, who was working with Coudenhove Kalergi in setting up the American branch of the Pan Europa in the 1920s. That's Walter Lippmann, the guy who's working with Edward Bernays to use the appearance of democracy to create feudalism, right? Karl Popper, who's training George Soros, a young sociopathic George Soros. These are all founders of the Mont Pelerin Society, and they're earlier all members of the 1939 Society for Renovation of Liberalism, set up by von Hayek. All of them. And so the idea is, again, to repackage Adam Smith, Mill, Malthus, but with a bit of a Herbert Spencer neo-Darwinian spin in a new synthesis, and use that now as part of the tactics during the Cold War, the age of bipolarism, while the Democrats are told they have to corral themselves around different types of Keynesianism. Even though John F. Kennedy was a Democrat, but he was anti-Keynes. So was Franklin Roosevelt, though they worked with Keynesians. So some people who were around them were Keynesian. That doesn't mean that Keynesianism had any effect on the origins of the policies that made JFK a threat to the oligarchy, in terms of all of his political policies for the investment tax credit, encouraging the development of mass infrastructure and water projects on the continent of America, or development in Africa. That was not Keynesian. It was because Keynes always wanted just a bancor, a one world currency form of exchange, to settle payments under a world government. And the Franklin Roosevelt networks around Harry Dexter White did mass battle with these eugenicists of Britain during Bretton Woods. And Keynes never forgave Dexter White. Dexter White died. I think he was probably killed in 1948 when he was, rallying to fight to get Henry Wallace elected president in 1948. But it's a different paradigm, I guess, is how I'm trying to think about this. And it seems like the Keynesians then, they have their variants. You have the modern monetary theory variation with its own weird. It takes the form of some of what made the United States work on the surface, but it extracts all of the substance, all of the actual. This is the way the Delphic system works, right? one of the ways that
how the systemic theft also, is accomplished. I mean, it's always at the end of the day is about, printing money, fractional reserve banking, and there's no sound money. I mean, I think that's the point. I think that people need to understand there's no sound money. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this systemic theft going on, for such a long time, at least for 100 years or so.
Well, the way I see sound money is it has to be tied. Money only has value. It's a creation we create. We choose to give money value as a basis of exchange. But
also it has to be limited. You know what I'm saying? Like relative scarcity in gold or absolute scarcity in Bitcoin. This is where we have, prosperity. We have technological innovation.
Let me ask you this: does Bitcoin have what are the limits of Bitcoin? What are how many?
21 million. And the last Bitcoin or the last, let's just say, it's not even close to 20. There's like a fraction below that, whatever. But the 21 millionth Bitcoin will be mined in the year 2140. So it's mathematically totally predictable.
But how much can it subdivide? How much can you subdivide?
One Bitcoin at the moment is still 100 million satoshis or subunits, right? But you could still make more subunits, but the absolute
what's the limit on the subunits? Because you can't get a limit unless you can limit the subunits. So what's the limit on the subunits?
Well, one Bitcoin equals
divide infinitely, right? Like any $1 can divide infinitely. I could divide. So what's the end?
No, but it's like this pizza comparison. I mean, you can cut it in molecular atomic structure, parts a pizza, but one pizza is one pizza. It's not going to get, it's not going to increase in the total absolute, in the total amount. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but if you could always subdivide forever, you're always getting infinite, and you could always give value to those infinite particles and subparticles and subparticles.
But it will increase in purchasing power. This is. I think this is the point. I think this is the ultimate point in Bitcoin. Once we have reached, the point of hyper-Bitcoinization, let's say, or critical mass of adoption worldwide or within many countries or communities or whatever, then the unit of account thinking will change, and then compared to the dollar or whatever, or to any other fiat currency that increasingly loses purchasing power.
What causes it to increase purchasing power? What would cause it to increase purchasing power?
Well, because as more and more people are holding it as a store of value, as a medium of exchange, as a unit of account, are trading and are thinking, in trading and exchanging value, as you said, then it will increase. I mean, from my rational thinking and from any other rational economist thinking, it would increase in purchasing power, right?
I don't know. I mean, because when you define purchasing power, let's define purchasing power first, because maybe we don't have the exact same definition. But when I think of purchasing power, I think of like $1 yesterday buying me less than the same dollar today. Like the power of the dollar to purchase increases, right, based on like something in the past when the same dollar was buying me less. Is that what you're thinking, or what do you think of when you think of defining purchasing power?
Yeah, with purchasing power, I mean, like we know, for example, that the purchasing power of $1 in 1913 compared to now has lost, I don't know, what is it, 95% of that value. So I think, okay, for the gold bucks, for example, like a gold coin can still buy you, or gold ounce can still buy you, a decent suit and a hotel room or something like that. I mean, this is the comparison that people always make with gold. So with and once even let's just suppose, let's just, for the sake of it, gold would become the gold, again, the gold standard, the monetary standard. Then you have, because gold has a relative scarcity, there's like additional mining of gold every year, like approximately between 1% and 3%, as far as I know. So there's a relative scarcity to it. But with Bitcoin, you only have 21 million. That's it. You have 21 million. That's the total amount, which will be, the last one will be mined in the year 2140. And as adoption increases, more people holding it as a store of value, trading it as a medium of exchange, and also what do you call it, calculating it as a unit account, then it would logically, increase in purchasing power. So that means, yeah, let's just say, a dollar.
But
would,
to
would,
keep it
would
more
increase your
concrete,
purchasing power.
so we have the same idea of purchasing power as a definition, which I guess is similar to inflation too, right? Like that the inflation is
that would be, yeah, the opposite would be deflation. And would have a deflation,
so
like technology.
very common.
When
I'm just keeping it elementary for people who might be listening and they're like,
yeah,
what are these?
Yeah. No, but it's a good question.
Okay.
Actually, it's a really important question. Like for example, Jeff Booth with his book, Why Deflation is the Key to an Abundant Future. And he's by now, a pure Bitcoiner, because he understands we need to get out of that system, of the fiat system, because we're thinking within that system. But once, for example, he always brings up technology, technological innovation, and becomes, it gets cheaper and cheaper. So that is actually technology in essence, in principle, is actually deflationary, because, you get more and more value, more utility, more functional.
Can I ask, just to keep it out of the realm, because I mean, the Keynesians, they're mathematical ivory tower people. They don't like reality. So we're not like that. So I'm just curious, to get it out of the realm of just too much theory, give me some examples practically where this has happened. Technological progress.
Or practically,
practically, any examples in our recent or farther past that you've studied that show us where we have done this, where we've done exactly what you've said, and where technological progress has increased, purchasing power has increased when this has been done. Because I just don't know. I don't have examples that I've seen.
So if we could just focus on technological deflation, it means, like, I don't know, think of any high-tech device, whether it be a TV device or a smartphone, a mobile phone, right? It has more efficiency, it's faster, it has more processing power, it has more utilities, it has more whatever. Let's say even apps. I mean, you can do anything. Or think of Kodak, for example, right? I mean, it was as soon as digital, digital processing of videos and pictures came, Kodak or the blockbuster videos, they got obliterated, because there came new technologies and it replaced it. And, with these new technological innovation developments, everything became more, as first of all, more affordable, faster, more efficient, more functional, more utilities. So you had to spend less to acquire, more technological advancements or innovation or utilities. And for example, I mean, let's just stick, for example, to Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin started off as, I don't know, as a fraction of a dollar in the year 2000, let's say 2009 or something. And now, and at that time, I think it was this great, case where this Bitcoin miner and Bitcoin and cryptographer, I think it was a Hungarian, spent like 10,000 euros, 10,000 Bitcoin on a pizza. He just wanted, to get it going, as a meter of exchange. And now, you just need a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a Bitcoin, 0.00 whatever, one Bitcoin to buy, the same thing, or a pizza or anything, or even a real estate. I mean, nowadays you can even, in certain places, whether it be in Dubai or in Europe or somewhere, I mean, there are places where you can literally buy with with Bitcoin, anything, real estate, cars, anything.
Let me just quickly, before we go off onto that one, because there's 2 points. I guess there was a question as you were speaking in the previous example of the Kodak being replaced by the digital camera systems. And I guess we could also include the digital recording devices tied to the whole telecommunications system of cell phones, which caused, the old school technology to reduce in value as the new one increased in value and got cheaper in time. Although my wife just had to buy a very expensive phone. I don't know why they're still so expensive, but all that to say, the technology, though, it strikes me, upon which the innovation was based for the cell phone that has these high quality photo taking processes on them, occurred because you have things like you had a NASA driver program that created the basis upon which the whole satellite grids, the internet systems, the metals processing capabilities were all put online by John F. Kennedy. And that involved the opposite of what you said in terms of this like a state driver process that brought a whole like grid of platform of tech on the line and gave subsidies to companies to do the job. So the example doesn't quite fit what I'm seeing as like the idea, what you were saying of
well, you could say it I mean, you're talking about like state-driven, like subsidized entrepreneur, but I'm talking about like free market, like entrepreneurship, where people, because there is still, in certain places on this planet, there is still, I mean, there is competition, right? There is competition, there's entrepreneurship, there is technological innovation. With it, it's now partially a fully subsidized or state-driven. That's another question, I think. But when you have competition, and advancements in technological sectors, whether it be microprocessors, nanochip technology, I don't know, whatever that is, or what do you call it, like fiberglass communication, or satellite communication, or just I mean, we could in any field of electronics, or even efficiency in the engine propulsion system, right? So nowadays, I mean, okay, we could talk about, but that's also again, because I mean, nowadays even you have to pay even more money for used cars, as I've heard. But that's because, again, it goes back to the monetary system, to the fiat system, where it's creating inflationary consequences, and that results again into, it results into inflation or hyperinflationary consequences of other products.
I guess my problem is just that a lot, and I'm totally in favor of like entrepreneurialism, and like there's a place for protectionism, and there's a place in my mind for free markets too. I'm not like ideologically all for one or all for the other. It's all about the context in my mind. But like a lot of the companies that innovated a lot of these really good things, fiber optic cables, other things, were all dependent upon a system of energy creation and distribution that allowed them to have the productive capabilities to build the machinery, test out their prototypes, all of these things that were not built because of the free markets per se. Like these grids were all required at different times in our past, a national investment and concept to create an environment for these things that we then can benefit from our hydroelectric dams and other things. So it's like, I don't know of an example where I know you can map on this system as a model onto things that already exist and use it, but I don't know where it had ever created such a system of wealth that then drove an anti-inflationary process. In any examples I can find in a pure sense in our recent or distant past. I just
but if I give you because I know the historical example from Safed and Amusi, he lays it out pretty well in his book Bitcoin Standard, or even Fiat Standard, where when before actually the detachment from the gold standard happened actually not in 1971 or sometime even before. Actually, it was even much earlier, before 1914, just right before the First World War. And he talks about the La Belle Epoque, and the time in that time when we still had our society or civilization had the gold standard, there were more original or what do you call it, primary technological innovation, which a lot of other technological innovation rest upon or was dependent upon for a long time. Let's say, for example, like would it be propulsion system, or I don't know, communication systems. So there were a lot of more free-minded spirits, innovators, engineers, inventors. And there was just more capacities to develop and to advance, human society, human civilization.
Well, here's the thing. I got to read the guy's book. I got to read his book. But
please do.
From my analysis, I know that looking at the banking history of America, like there's been, if you look at Lincoln's greenbacks as one example, that was a period, and especially in the immediate period after the war, of a lot of wealth creation. Like the transcontinental railway was built up, industrial like there was a lot in the healing, the recovery of the United States from the British directed Civil War was relatively miraculous. And Bismarck commented on the amazingness of how quick this was able to work. But then what happened was, you had the Specie Resumption Act, which occurred, I think, in 1876 or 77, that began to really annihilate the greenbacks, and it pegged dollar to a 1-to-1 relationship to gold. But then when I look at the orbit, it's like nothing stopped immediately. Like in a mathematical space, you put in like one variable, you'll get an immediate effect in the computer program. But in reality, we have physical space time, we have momentum, all this stuff. So all this momentum was created under Lincoln and the early part of the Ulysses S. Grant's administration for development. So it was a lot of momentum. So it continued even after the Species Resumption Act was brought in. But then what started happening, what you could start seeing is all of a sudden you start getting massive destabilizations, fluctuations of the markets, because now all of a sudden, who's controlling the gold? Well, it was the gold barons. It was the city of London that had controlled the Cecil Rhodes mining corporations, and then they were able to artificially manipulate the price by deregulating the market so that speculators could gamble on what they thought the price of the gold was going to be.
That's one of the reasons gold failed. Yeah,
and then all of a sudden the U.S. dollar became less of a reliable thing, and slowly the momentum started seizing up for progress, and then you started seeing inflation grow, and the buying power began to fall as less people wanted to invest in the U.S. dollar. But it was all like based on these real political agendas, of which are often, I think, overlooked by the academic writings of people who tend to comment on these things, and they don't think about the fact that you have this oligarchical agency with their techniques of subverting nations by getting us to just think about apolitical ideologies or filters of analysis about banking or other things. I don't know so much about France. I know that Sidi Carnot was ushering in, who was killed right in 1895. He was ushering in a robust Colbert. It was like a Colbertist revival. The same thing that inspired the U.S. was being brought back in the 1890s in France around dirigism, state credit for big infrastructure and things like that. But then that under Clemenceau, that started also getting undermined too, as they were. So it's a bit of a weird thing. I'm not too sure about the France case. I would like to read this guy's book, but my concern is again, like what I know is that the cause of the purchasing power increasing or anti-deflationary spending, because you have inflationary and deflationary spending. So there's some types of spending which, like, if I'm a farmer and I got no tractor, but I know how to farm, I might create a little bit of a debt to take a loan to buy that tractor in order to farm my land, such that I'm going to produce more abundance that by like next year, I'll pay off the tractor and have more free energy to reinvest to pay for my workers and my growing, farm business. Same thing for a nation, like if I'm a nation and I take out a debt to build a bunch of casinos, because I think I can make more money off of state managed casinos like you have in Canada. It's a lot of Quebec and shit. Like, this is all of the vice. Buying drugs is state run in Canada. You got to go to you want to buy alcohol in Quebec, you got to go to a state owned alcohol store, because they make more money. But it's like, but at the same time, you're destroying the overall vitality of your people to exist. You're by getting them all on drugs or addicted to gambling. It makes your nation actually weaker, less productive, and thus buying power collapses. Inflation is going to increase as you print more money circulating or whatever. But it's you can even have the same amount of money and it could still lose value. Like, even if you cap the money at like in a limited amount, it could still lose value if your overall nation is not producing in a better way. So for me, it's like, if Bitcoin is tied to processes that are increasing the qualitative productive powers, okay, good.
Yeah,
but
that would increase the efficiency of allocation of capital.
Well,
also,
can't have it as an article of faith that people will just naturally like organize to create, electricity grids. If I just like let everybody just like do their thing and have like free reign Bitcoin with no national government, all of a sudden I'm going to have like a repaired, electricity rail grid, other thing. No, I don't see that happening. I think you need to get people to take their nation back and then, fight to expunge the deep state and then look to the problems again in which case Bitcoin can play feasibly a very important role. But I guess my thing, I'm reacting a little bit to the fact that many promoters of Bitcoin that I encounter, I don't think you're like this, but a lot do tend to see it from the standpoint of, I've already given up on trying to take back my nation. I've given up, and this is my way of getting outside of the game into my little local feeling that I'm free in a local.
Oh, I see. I was saying, no, there's a spectrum. I mean, I'm
yeah. But I get a lot of that. I get
against,
yeah.
I'm more now because I, also, read a lot about, Hoppe and I mean, I do understand, the basic principal problems that the state, the nation state and the government. And I mean, I'm more for local, communities, local government, local, real. I mean, people talk about democracy, but I think we need to go back to the roots. And even enhance, the characteristics which they have, for example, in Switzerland, where they vote on and they can decide over, regional, communal, local, decision-making processes. You know what I'm saying? But there's a spectrum of people, whether they call them libertarians or anarchists or like totally anti-nation state, anti-government. But there's really a huge spectrum within the Bitcoin. So we can't even, I couldn't even pinpoint, but I think the principles of Austrian economics, sound money, an absolute scarcity, a decentralization, non-confiscatability. So there's a lot of, properties and characteristics which Bitcoin has, which, gold, that's why there's a lot of reason why gold failed, in the first place, because it always goes back to trust, to centralization, and to confiscation, and to, you cannot really use it you can maybe, use it as a store of value, but then there's a limit to it. And that's why Bitcoin, from my point of view or perspective, it just has so many, positive which had not been resolved until now for the first time in human history. But
as the pragmatic side of myself, I'm like all for that. So I look for things that will work to get the job done. I'm against extremes, because I know that's how the oligarchy plays us into like being all big state or all personal freedom or whatever, and they always get us that way. Whereas me, I'm like always trying to find, well, what's the principled harmony of what appears to be opposites in a principled way, which causes the oligarchy to lose power every time it's done, and causes us to become more in alignment with natural law, which is why,
yeah. Because, I'm a huge fan of, why I'm a huge fan, because you talk about, all the structural problems we have, you talk about the oligarchies, the City of London. So my vision, my personal vision is really like, once we have this critical mass adoption, that we can finally start, it's not going to resolve everything, but it will structurally, from a roots upwards, it will, transform everything. Like Buckminster Fuller said, you don't need to fight the system. I'm just paraphrasing. You just need to create a new system, right? So that's what we are hoping and what we are wishing. That's sort of our ethos and mission amongst our Bitcoiners, is like to create a new system, right? So we can make the old one obsolete, so we don't have to fight all these, criminals that have been systematically stealing from us, not only like monetarily, financially, but also technologically, spiritually. On every fucking level you can imagine, we've been like totally like fucked up, right? Especially in the last 100 years.
All I can say is,
before going in a rant.
No. It's a healthy rant. It's good righteous indignation, and it's healthy. My point though is, I don't think that the oligarchy will let anybody just go off and recreate their own system without killing them, like we've seen in Maui. There's so many places where you think you have these idealistic communities of people who are like self-sustaining, and they're off the grid. So now Maui's not off the grid, but really it was a very self-sustaining, very, very autonomous community, annihilated by space-based, what appears to be space-based lasers that have been developed. It's
definitely directed energy weapons. It's all. The history is so long.
I know. I'm quite persuaded. I'm quite persuaded
that that's overwhelming.
Or you got all these people, in like Pennsylvania, in one of the densest like small and medium farm growing regions in the world in Ohio that has seen some conscious derailment of toxic waste spillage into their water system, ground systems. And I mean, I see all of this as coordinated. So I do think that we do need to fight the oligarchy. And I don't think that the oligarchy will sit back and just let a whole bunch of autonomous communities just like go Amish and like go solo very easily. That's my concern.
But do you think it's a little bit too late sometimes? Sometimes I'm thinking, oh my God, people are so fucking asleep. I don't know.
That's the cynicism I fight with too inside of myself, because it's like, well, like me, tell you what, before Trump was elected, and I was sure that Hillary was coming in. I kind of disengaged from politics quite a bit. And I stopped my magazine. I stopped writing. And it was only one day in 2017 that I for shits and giggles, I like logged back onto my Canadian Patriot website, working in my office job. And I just a curiosity, just to look at the dashboard just to see if there's any activity. You know, did 10 people show up this month or something? I know I haven't updated it in 2 years. And there's like 5,000 people showing up every day to my website that hadn't been touched for years. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And so I was like, wait a minute, something has changed. And I realized that something did shift with the idea that the US was not hopeless, even though it since JFK's murder, it got so controlled and so dominated by this evil entity. I was like, wow, something is a little bit different than I expected. So I began to write again. I was like, okay, I should probably use this to help contribute to the process in a positive way somehow. And I started noticing that I was submitting my articles to websites that I had formerly, under Obama, I was writing. I started my Canadian Patriot in 2012. And I was submitting my articles to all sorts of alternative media magazines and stuff, and nobody would touch my stuff. And then all of a sudden, everything I was submitting was getting picked up, published. I was getting paid for some of my stuff, and I'm like, what? Something is different in the zeitgeist, right? Like there's a different. So that forced me to soul search a little bit, to think like, was my cynicism ill-placed? Where did I go wrong in my thinking? That the New World Order was like, it's just a matter of when. It's a done deal. And also too, you know, because I told you I was working with the LaRouche organization of the Schiller Institute. I had been organizing for LaRouche's program in Canada. You know, I would go to Ottawa in 2007, 2008, 2009, and we did table organizing with the population. And so I was doing this like every day. This was my thing for a sustained period. But part of my message to people, even though I didn't fully believe it, was the financial system is going to collapse. It's all based on a derivatives bubble of unpayable debts. It's going to collapse, and it's designed to collapse because they want to kill us and reduce the world population. That was part of my messaging, and it took me a while to research and fully integrate that. But part of it was, we don't have to. We can do Glass-Steagall. We can break up the banks the way Franklin Roosevelt did. We can get a national recovery. We can. We were talking about the new Silk Road. So the idea that there's, you know, a possibility for a new Silk Road program of reconstruction across Eurasia that we could participate in, that could save Europe, that could save that. We were talking about that, and you could read the writings from some of the magazine we were running with was called Executive Intelligence Review. And going back to like 1992, they were already publishing material, like putting out the design strategically for how the new Silk Road could break the oligarchy and stop the New World Order, and giving conferences all over the world to promote this. And they were being picked up by people like Sergei Glaziev, Putin's advisor, who is a student of LaRouche and has said so openly. And leading figures in China were bringing some of these LaRouche representatives to Beijing to speak and give conferences on how this works. How did America do Hamiltonian banking? How did Friedrich List do this in Germany? And how could this apply to the Eurasian, Russian, Chinese experience? But it was only with 2013 that Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative and the new Silk Road. I didn't think it was going to happen. And then a head of state goes and says it. This thing I'd been talking about, they go and say it, and then they do it. And I'm like, okay, so there's a lot going on. behind the scenes that we are not privy to, even those of us who watch alternative media, but there's cracks that show us that the oligarchy has less of a hold on us than they want us, than they want to believe. They want us to believe that they're gods. They actually don't. That's why the League of Nations didn't work the first time, because their attempt at a world government a century ago was the League of Nations. It failed because they're not gods, though they want to be. And so today it's sort of the same thing. China and Russia have used the power of the nation state to block the COP26, COP27 carbon dioxide reduction quotas. The only reason why that didn't succeed was not because of us in Canada or the USA or European countries. It's because of India, China, Russia, some African countries, but specifically China and India, but mostly China, that blocked these things from becoming law. They stopped it.
Well, yeah, blocking the fraud. I mean, for good, thanks God. I mean, they're, because it's a huge scientific.
Yeah, we'd already be dead. Like there would be nothing to even like have this conversation on at that point if that world government was already imposed. So it's bought us time to strategize. And I mean, I'm seeing that Trump hasn't given up. There's a possibility of a Trump, Bobby Kennedy Jr. Alliance possibly that could feasibly happen to be part of the fight to there's so much fraud, it's hard to say, right? Like obviously people would vote for that, but would the level of organized fraud within the voting systems permit that?
Oh my God,
I don't even know, man.
Yeah, it's all coming to the surface. It's unbelievable that the cesspool of corruption.
But there's a fight. So I know that I got to be part of the fight while the fight is happening. And at that point, if there was no fight, then it's like survival mode. Like I'm going, like I have to think a totally different way that I'm not used to thinking.
To come to the mountains.
Yeah. At that point, I'm visiting. I'm knocking at the door.
Gotta go deer hunting or something. I don't know.
Yeah. We'll forage for rabbits.
Okay.
I mean, that's where we're at.
Right.
I do think that if we just take what works in our past principally, it would do a remarkable amount of good work to destroy the oligarchy's power base and elevate us to a better way. I think Russia and China are fighting really much more valiantly than people realize, and I think we could be a part of that fight. But yeah, it's an interesting time of history to be alive. That's for sure. It's a very
yeah. And I mean, there's a different chapter which I would want to talk about maybe next time about a very possible scenario. I mean, there's hardcore data and scientific facts and studies done on micronova solar shots that could happen by the latest of 2050. A natural cycle, and a very natural cycle. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of Suspicious Observer, Ben Davidson, the guy.
I love him. I love that show. Yeah,
he's genius. I mean, of course, he says he doesn't have a crystal ball. There's no firm prediction or something like that. But it is very, very realistic that there's like different Earth disaster cycles coming and happening. And, the magnetic field of the Earth is exponentially reducing since, I don't know, for many decades now. So all these like parameters and factors are playing in. And so we are already like sort of preparing ourselves for this kind of scenario, what we're going to do. I mean, we are, on top of a mountain somewhere. So, I guess, but there are certain places on this Earth, I guess in Colorado somewhere, I don't know where this guy is, or is in Texas, it's like pretty safe, because there's going to be really huge disaster cycles, and all the information communication grid's going to be taken out, and then we don't have to worry about Bitcoin anymore because we don't have any. We're going to go back to the Stone Age probably, and we need something to eat, and we need to survive and take care of each other.
Then we're back to trading seashells.
Yeah.
But we could talk about this in a future podcast, because I do find astroclimatology absolutely important and fascinating.
Yeah, but people put their heads into some of that. This is what I don't understand. I'm asking people like who are, sending satellites into the orbit for Bitcoin transactions. I mean, like, how do you guys prepare? I mean, what if a micronova solar shot happens and it takes out all the fucking, communication information system? What are you going to do? What are we going to do?
In Quebec. Look, I mean, people could say this happened in Quebec in 1989. We got a direct hit by a small coronal mass ejection that hit Quebec like dead on. And our grids were shot out. It took 2 weeks to start getting electricity back on. At the time, this is 30 years ago. So we still had some manufacturing industrial production in place in Quebec that was able to build new transmitters, transformers that were all shot. Today, that's gone. Like, we don't have that anymore. All of the productive capability to do that ourselves is gone. So yeah, like we get missed quite often by coronal mass ejections that come pretty close, or that just you know, if we get a dead on slamming, yeah, you can easily overcharge the grid, and yeah, deactivate your satellite. All this terrible stuff that would involve chaos beyond belief.
Beyond belief, yeah,
absolutely. And people need to take this stuff very seriously.
Very seriously.
There's things you could do. There's things you could do. Like, you don't have to just wait for it to hit. There are ways of creating Maxwell sort of magnetic shells to protect your satellites, to do things, to have productive systems in place to build the transformers. If they get blown out, you want to be able to build them within a day. You know, you don't want to let your hospitals have no electricity for weeks, or refrigeration go to shit for weeks. You know, you want to be able to get stuff back online. So there's things we could do as human being problem solvers,
right?
Premeditate or preemptively act on this sort of thing. But we're not, like you said, people who should be thinking about this are just, I don't know, man. It's just, yeah, there's a myopia.
And officially, we are not even on that Kardashev. What do you call it? Kardashev evolutionary, whatever scale or something like that. I think we're not even on the Kardashev. What is it? Is it called Kardashev? I don't know. Whatever. You know, it's like the evolutionary degree of civilization or something like that. But anyway, I mean, I do think there are some technologies developed but not accessible to us within the military-industrial complex. But that's a whole chapter by itself.
Yeah.
So Matthew, I don't want to. I'm sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. But there was one fundamental question I wanted to.
All right. One last
thing. You mentioned in one of your recent interviews, because it reminded me of the interview with this guy. Let me just screenshot this here. Put it on the here. The Immortality Key: The Secret History of the Religion with No Name by Brian C. Murarescu. And it goes about, very deep into psychedelics, and it's got beautiful, book reviews and everything else. So, and Joe Rogan had an interview with this author, Brian C. Murarescu, and you mentioned in one of your recent interviews that you think I don't want to paraphrase you, but you said something like, it could be that Jesus Christ and his followers were using psychedelics and hallucinogenic, substances. Do you want to elaborate? Do you have a position on psychedelics at all? Are you an advocate? That's what I'm interested in. What do you think about Christianity and religion and spirituality and enlightenment? Is there
I think that the oligarchy, I mentioned that their obsession has been the revival of global oligarchical feudalism under some unipolar imperial class. With an occult, inner esoteric elite with their own, occult perspective on the universe of an evil god that they're made in the image of, a whole perverse inner culture core, with their that involves grooming the next generation according to these long traditions going back to ancient days of Babylon and the Roman Empire. The most evil days of the Roman Empire. It's the same worst of those traditions. And they want to organize society with different layers of these similar but diffused occult religious orders down all the way to the plebes, who are supposed to just be happy slaves with their own spirituality. The auxiliaries above will be happy slaves with their own spirituality and their own egotistical mythologies that give them a sense of elitism, but they themselves are peons for the higher echelon above them, all the way to the points of some inner core. So I think that's the general, and you need a political structure, a political economic structure to make that happen materially. And that's the whole fight for world government, a depopulated, COP27 type of green global dictatorship, masquerading maybe with some capitalist surface appearances, but not really. It's all feudalism. But ultimately, I think their primary obsession has been to create a global religious system that's shaping the self-image of man around a way of being and thinking of our spirituality, which is a rehashing of the old Eleusinian mystery religions of ancient Greece, Persia, Babylon, and Rome, which are animated by, I think, psychedelics, early psychedelics that were derived. I believe that the author that you referenced, Brian, whose last name I can't pronounce,
Morescu, yeah,
Morescu. I think that it's true what he's saying, that ancient cults used psychedelics derived from plant or wheat blight, which does have a bit of a hallucinatory, effect on the mind, and other things, mushrooms, other forms of mushrooms in various shamanic rituals have used that to also have a similar psychedelic experience. That was part of the rites of initiation within the mystery religions, pre-Christian, and also this is what people like St. Augustine and the early Christian fathers were fighting against, was the perversion of the of early Christianity by these sects that were just rehashing the old mystery religions that involved, Baal worship, Dionysian worship, Apollo worship. Apollo just being a prototype for Lucifer, who is sort of the rebellious son of Zeus, who had too big of an ego and was punished and fell, but was still the god of light. So that's Apollo. And before Apollo was sort of the revamping of the god of Marduk, the key god of the Babylonian mystery schools. So these gods just sort of get rehashed, rebranded according to different cultures that they're going to be applied to, but it's the same model. So I think that the Jesuits were created by the Habsburgs as part of one dimension of a multifaceted secret society operation of Gnostic cults to undermine and undo authentic Christianity, which is based upon the moral faith, but also moral action at the same time. So faith and action, not faith or action. To love God, love your fellow neighbor, and love yourself, as the book of Matthew prescribes, in a manner that is anti-imperial. So you want to do it from the standpoint of organizing against powers and principalities who are the enemies of Christianity, and not simply making people feel good. But the mystery schools, I think, that are being revived now, and Brian Morescu, also Graham Hancock is another popular promoter of this today, is essentially reviving the old ancient mystery cults that Augustine and others did battle with under a new, more synthetic drug cult, calling itself in some cases Christianity. Like it'll be it's being repackaged in some cases for neo pseudo Christians or people who don't want to be atheists anymore, or whoever. And it's being set up as a groundwork for a new global synthetic religion with a UFO twist. So they're also preparing the idea that we communicate with beings from other dimensions, which different people thought of were as ETs, but in actuality, these are most likely, we've been told, beings from the 11th dimension or 5th dimension or 7th dimension, whatever the fuck those things are, because really they're just mathematical entities that don't exist as far as like these dimensions, right? So they're preparing the climate for that, and there's things like Bluebeam. Project Bluebeam is one of many different operations that have been refined over the Cold War to use holographic technology, light shows in the sky that will then project either Christ coming back, like they've tried to do in Brazil a couple of years ago, or like they tried to do to overthrow Castro under the Edward Lansdale project of elimination by illumination, which is what, the idea was the CIA was going to project a light show over Cuba, projecting the second coming of the Christ, who wants the Cubans to overthrow Castro, who's the Antichrist. That was like a CIA project that JFK stopped.
Yeah.
So they've been working on this sort of shit for a long time.
Or Werner von Braun, with his last card, that I think that was one of his last words. Werner von Braun, with his sort of, they would use it as a false flag alien invasion.
He had a friend who recorded or who testifies that she heard him say that he told that to her, and it's possible. I mean, he was on the inside. He knew how the machine works. So the idea that they would use like an alien invasion to try to unify the world around a common threat, that's something that was even put online. We're making a documentary about this, my wife and myself, and Jason, our friend Jason Dahl, who's a master filmmaker, on how the same agencies that killed JFK, including Alan Dulles, everyone JFK fired, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, who was the manager of Area 51 and the deputy director of the CIA, who worked with to overthrow Castro as well. They're the same. They were all participating in a leading way into the UFO cult throughout the entirety of the Cold War. So we're going to go with some crazy detail there, but I think, yeah, what you're seeing with it's not just the immortality key that's trying to bring back or romanticize the cult of Eleusis and the cult of Dionysius. But there's thousands of these books all being promoted. There's Netflix videos, documentaries, other things to promote this idea that that's what Christianity was. Christ was just an initiate into the Eleusinian drug mysteries, and that's how he was able to recruit so many people, because he gave them drugs. I think it's satanic. I think this is actually satanic. And I don't believe in I don't use that word lightly, and I don't believe in like a literal force that is Satan, but I believe in evil, that human beings can be evil. Yeah. And this is part of
just look at the pedophilia, the systemic pedophilia and the satanism and the sadistic satanism. I mean, it's mind-blowing. You know, every time we're like, okay, we know everything now, you know, and then you wake up again next day, like, oh my God, it's beyond imagination of an evil. I mean, it's it's really, I have no words sometimes, but
no, me too. So that's my thought. That's my thought on this shit. Is I think it's a satanic new spirituality controlled by the elite as part of a new global great narrative that they want to bring online. But it's nothing to be trusted. And I'm not against look, for psychedelics, the way I approach it is for extreme cases of hardcore depression where your brain is badly wired, certain types of psychedelics might, under a controlled circumstance, help to depattern and help give you the type of space you need to find a way of thinking out of your depression. Maybe. But the issue that is often left out is that the reason why people are so friggin' depressed is because we have such an unnatural system that is ultimately of globalization that is so unnatural and ultimately evil, that we're told is good, that we have to adapt to, that we know deep down inside is not. And so, of course, people get nihilistic. They our culture is shit. Our economic system is shit. We got no prospects for a future. So, of course, people will get depressed. And sure, then you could find radical therapeutic techniques to help people live happily or satisfactorily within that corrupt system. But at the end of the day, that has to be dealt with. And that's often not even discussed. So, and my last message for people who want to either do psychedelics or want to continue to, or maybe get into it to explore psychedelics to open up new doors of perception of their mind, the way Aldous Huxley
or creativity, or understanding. Like, it's also about comprehension, like comprehending from a totally different perspective, which you have never thought of. So being creative, or
maybe. But what I would say is they want to skip steps. They want the effect of creativity without having first learned how this beautiful instrument called our mind even works naturally in the first place. So they've only known how their mind works when it is not natural, but they've never gotten an experience, because of our shit education system and shit culture. They've never gotten to get the taste of how to work and use this beautiful instrument in the first place. And they want to just then skip steps from a sick state into a creative psychedelic state that maybe might give them a better spirituality without learning how the mind works first. So I would just say, learn how the mind works when it's being rigorous, productive, listen to classical music, read original writings, do original work, and start write your thoughts down. People should learn how the mind works in a sober, creative way, and then revisit with some psychedelics if you want or something, and compare. Are you more effective that way? Is that a more effective type of creativity than the type you had when you were using your instrument in a sober? Or not, but but don't skip steps. That's my whole thing. Every time people skip steps, things get messy.
Right. I mean, I can only, I know it from other people's encounter and experience, and also from my own. And I mean, I can only speak positively about it. Would it be, psilocybin or other so-called magic mushroom, it really, I mean, it really, it's a key. It's a shortcut, to be honest with you. It is a shortcut, and it's a key that you can open any portal, any door you can go into with a question, and it really helps you, to whatever that is, whether it's a trauma, depression, something that is really, or you talked about the educational system, or about, childhood, about parenthood, I mean, you grow up with all this shit, all your life long, and then it catapults you into really a different, perception, consciousness, thinking process, dimension.
Well, like I said, I did a lot of shrooms in my day as well. And I could say for the most part, it was a positive experience. Back when but I mean, I was still, it's the me that was still walking in a lot of ignorance. I didn't start my exploration about what the hell was shaping my world. And for what it was, I wouldn't say it's evil. I wouldn't say I would say I had good experiences through that. Sometimes I had some bad trips too. But the overall idea of shortcuts for me has become now, through 20 years of like pretty much ongoing research and like obsessive ongoing research to try to figure out the truth in an uncompromising way, and to figure out how I can become a better person and a better possible leader that I need to become, because I'm not there yet. And I immerse myself in speeches of JFK and Martin Luther King to study how they're thinking, how they're feeling. I read a lot of speech. So for me, I'm trying to use a lot of very high standards as my role models. And I've noticed that it didn't take me long to notice that my mind on shrooms or on weed was not helping me when I began that new identity and that new type of exploration. It didn't help me. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that in a very light way, but it probably was crippling when I started that type of new type of rigor and self-discipline of my mind and my research. Mm-hmm. It was doing the opposite of what I wanted. So that's my experience for me. It might be different for other people. Everyone's a different person, but that's for me. So
and there's a fundamental difference, right? I mean, between like THC, cannabis, and psychedelic, like psilocybin or magic mushroom. You do that maybe if you do it like on a regular basis, at all, like once a year or every 2 or 3 years. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not something like,
I don't know. I don't know about the frequency. All I know is the oligarchy wants us to be on it. That's why the Harvard psilocybin project was created by MK Ultra in 1953 and ran all the way up through the 1960s. That's where Ted Kaczynski was processed. Oh. The reason why psilocybins are a part of our world is because the CIA and the same people that want to kill us want it to be there. Mm-hmm. It's not like it got out of control and then the hippies just were so great that they had to do a war on drugs to try to put it back in the bottle. It wasn't that. The war on drugs was designed to fail and to create more organized crime networks that were affiliated with those same people who were in the banks, in Wall Street, in London, in Washington, who were on the surface trying to put every petty drug dealer in prison. It was never meant to work. It was always designed to make the problem even worse and make people want it even more. And that's why, so psilocybins, just to restate, just like LSD 25 and just like DMT, were products of CIA MK Ultra research and were put into our culture because they want it there.
Yeah. But it's always the intention behind it also is determined, it is very important, I think. What's the intention? How do you what's the setting? How do you use it? Are you being manipulated? I mean, is it out of a free intention and a free, I don't know. Is there some subtle differences do you see? Or I mean, I do get it.
I think for people who are in a state of serious trauma and depression, there might be therapeutic benefits to depatterning, which is what the psychedelics are quite good at. Depatterning neural pathways that are too locked in and rigid. That might be beneficial from a therapeutic standpoint, but you can do that as well, I think, in a more organic way that might take more work in a more durable, substantial way without that.
Right.
It's just that sometimes in an emergency, you might need that if you're on the verge of committing suicide. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, probably, I'm come to the place now where I'm like, I don't think that there's too many positive applications of it at this stage in human civilization. I think we have to get rid of the oligarchy and revisit the question. I think we have to. Yeah, that's what
very, very fascinating, your perspective and your position on that. Okay. But even like in a certain setting, you know, with a shaman or curandero in the jungle, you know, you spend like 3 months in the jungle, like a holistic ayahuasca, you know, ceremony. Is that something? Because I've never done that. I'm just, you know,
I've never done that either. I've seen a lot of testimonies of people like Graham Hancock, who I've read a lot of Graham Hancock's work, who's done a lot of that. And no, I mean, I don't. I think that every culture had their imperial drug cults and mystery religions that were tied to different types of what, you know, in the West we might call like South American shamanistic or like African voodoo or other shamanistic structures that had their own, that had variations on the theme, but they're all the same variations and all the same theme. And I think they're ultimately things that cripple our ability to be the type of humans that are made in the image of a living, loving, creative, reasonable God that the oligarchy has been trying to destroy and undermine in every religion, as far as whenever it manifests in the Islamic context or in the Buddhist context or Hindu context. There's this very positive, brilliant idea of human beings as creative geniuses with dignity, freedom that we will fight for and die for to defend, and organize systems and laws in defense of against the oligarchy, whether it's and then there's the same techniques that are used to undermine that in ancient times in India, in China, in the advanced Olmec cultures that had advanced civilization in South America that involve similar techniques, Aztecs, other things. And so I the way I see it, my current analysis is that the shamanistic religions or spiritual paths are carryovers, residuals of the oligarchical agencies that destroyed from within the societies that were very advanced and elevated of the Americas, or of Africa as well, that had very advanced civilizations that were like far advanced than even Europe in the 12th century, that were undermined from within by these organized cults that usually have a common organizing center.
Are you going to incorporate this, what you just talked about, into the documentary series?
I might, but it's so hard because there's so many moving parts that I know it's difficult for people's minds to sort of look at several processes at the same time, that I might have to do a series of videos or focus more on the UFO psyop and maybe just allude to the religious manipulation, but I don't know how to make it work yet fully. I'm still working on this. I've gone through like 18 scripts and I'm trying to make it work.
But hey, just for the final question, this whole Grush test, hearing and with this UFO that's a total military intelligence psyop.
Yeah, right? It's a military intelligence psyop. Oh, yeah, we're all being fucked with. They're screwing with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's going to be in the documentary. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we're really looking forward. When is it going to come out? I mean, are you?
Hopefully soon. Hopefully very soon. I'm aiming for September.
Okay.
Maybe mid to late September. Right now, it's still in script stage, so we'll see how many. Usually, when I do it, our filmmaker will produce a beautiful thing, but with a ton of problems, and then I'm gonna have to send it back, and we do 18 revisions.
Yeah, it's a process.
And then finally, we have a product, so it'll come.
Well, very well. Looking forward. Very excited. So Matthew, where else can people find you on besides? Is there anything coming up besides the documentaries? Are you writing another book or research?
Yeah. You are? Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm writing a book on the science unshackled, sort of going through the subversion of science from a few thousand years ago to the present.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it'll be fun. So that's almost done. I have very little to do. Maybe that should come out by Christmas time, maybe November. My wife is also working on the occult origins of fascism, her volume 2 of her series, which is going to be crazy
work.
If people don't know how the Theosophists and Madame Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley are tied to Nazism, and fascism more generally, this book is for you.
It's overdue. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Wonderful.
so otherwise, if people do want, we have a lot of author copies. So if people want to pick up any of our books, The Clash of the Two Americas, volume 1 to 4, or the Untold History of Canada books, 1 to 4, or the Breaking Free of Anti-China Psyops, you can get signed copies from my wife and myself or her book by sending me an email to info@risingtidefoundation.net. If people would like to listen to our weekly seminars, we do every Sunday, experts on various fields that give presentations on either history or science or whatever. That's every Sunday. So people can also write an email to that same email, info@risingtidefoundation.net, and I can give you the links to that. Otherwise, yeah, just stay up on my Patriot website or my Substack. There's always good stuff that I try to put out there.
Wow. Well, Matthew, it was really so grateful for your time and for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom, and really learned much. And I'm sure my listeners and followers too. So thank you so much again. And we hope we can continue our conversation.
Yeah, me too, man. I look forward to the next Astroclimatology conversation. It'll be fun.
Right.
All right, take care.
When you're in Austria.